So this morning we have the great privilege of having Patrick Regan coming to speak to us. He has been involved in many, many things. I remember my time from when he was doing a lot of youth work for XLP in London and used many and many of his resources, which have been a great help in the youth work I've done. And he's here this morning to just share with us around resilience. And we've been running one of his other groups called Kintsugi Hope, which has been a really, really great thing to hear stories of just how people have been able to use that just to help themselves in rebuilding and restoring themselves. So, in great Broadmead fashion, could you give him a really big round of applause as I invite Patrick up.
Good morning. I'm on, yeah? Oh, great. There you go. It all works. Good morning, everyone. It's brilliant to be here. It's an absolute privilege. I do have one of the best jobs where I get to travel a lot and meet some amazing people. So thank you so much for welcoming us. We really, really do appreciate it. Just turn to someone around you. I know it's so hard in this condition to say, you look absolutely fantastic in your mask this morning. Great, and welcome to everyone that's joining on the live stream as well. I hope that you enjoy being with us this morning, and it'll be really, really good to be with you. And so, just a couple of things. Who remembers their school assembly? Does anyone remember their school assembly being the most riveting, exciting, dynamic moment of your school career? Anyone? Just put your hand up. Anyone remembers a school assembly like that? A couple of people. You're not school teachers, no? No. But I heard this one story, which I find quite amusing, is of a teacher who basically, all the pupils were coming in and they had to walk past a desk, a little bit like this. And on the desk were these basket of juicy-looking apples. And above the basket of apples, there was a sign. And the sign said, "Take one apple only, God is watching." And with that, the kids looked a little bit scared, as you would, you know. And so they wandered on past, they sort of looked around, took an apple, sat down. But as they left the assembly hall, there was another table. And on that table was this delicious-looking chocolate brownie. And one of the kids had written a sign, and it basically said, "Take as much brownie as you want, God's watching the apples." You know, so often we've communicated a God that's mean, that God just wants to tell you off the whole time and doesn't want you to have too much fun. And yeah, actually that's not the God that I think that I want to love and serve. And within Kintsugi Hope, our whole vision really is we want to help people to find safe and supportive spaces for whatever's going on in their lives. And I'm going to be sharing the vision of Kintsugi Hope a little bit later. But what we'd love to say is, if there is anyone here who'd love to pray for us, we have these little cards at the back which you can fill in. And each month we send out a newsletter. It's got a podcast on it, looking at emotional mental well-being. I think the new podcast is from Kathy Madavan, talking about honesty. There's blogs on there, there's stories on there. And we'd normally send around a clipboard, but you can't do that in COVID land. But so if you do want to pray for us, then please fill in one of those. That would be fantastic at the stand there at the back. Also just want to mention that I'm not here on my own. I'm also here with Joel. Joel heads up our youth stuff. So if you've got any interested in young people, schools work, then do talk to Joel. And we've got Matt and Jess here as well. Jess works coordinating the comms. Matt's our husband that also helps out at lots of events and does some amazing work with some of our technology and some of our videos and graphics and all sorts of things. So we're really, really, really grateful to be here with you today. And also, just to say, in the time of COVID, I have to say this. If you do want to get anything from our shop, there's card readers and all that sort of stuff and hand sanitizer and all that jazz. So we should be good to go. So what happened with me is a couple of years ago, I wrote a number of books. I wrote these two books, When Faith Gets Shaken, which we've just updated actually, and this looked at where is God when suffering hurts. Not from an apologetic point of view particularly, but from a real personal view. When you're going through hell and back, where is God then? And then I followed that up with this book called Honesty Over Silence, and it has this tagline on it, as you can see, it's okay not to be okay. And from writing both of those books, I got sent so many emails, which were both heartbreaking and heartwarming. Heartbreaking because people are telling me the shame that they felt, particularly after Honesty, because Honesty was really talking about emotional and mental health, and just asking for a more real, authentic, honest conversation about those things. And it was really, really interesting. And as I read them, I found it, really moving. And I thought, you know what? I really do believe that it's okay not to be okay. I really do believe that. But I don't want people to get stuck not being okay. I want people to thrive. But I also realize I'm not naive to think that suddenly, everything suddenly becomes perfect again. So somehow we have to live with this tension, don't we, between blessing and battles. Because they're the two railway tracks. They always go together. Blessings and battles, blessings and battles. But how do we thrive in the midst of adversity? So I said to my publisher, I want to write another book. This was January last year. And I think I'm going to do it on resilience. And resilience, by definition, is thriving in the midst of adversity. And so I started to think about it. But imagine how I felt trying to write a book about thriving in the midst of adversity. In March, COVID hit. And then the unjust murder of George Floyd, and all the other things that started to unravel. And I thought, I can't write this now, surely. And my wife was like, come on, Patrick, for a time such as this, you can do this. And so we did. But as I started to look into it, a lot of people describe resilience as the ability to bounce back. I don't know if you've heard this on the news recently. Will the economy bounce back? Will education bounce back? Will church bounce back? Will anyone come back? What is going on about this coming back, the whole business? And as I was studying it, I was like, you know what? I don't want to bounce back. Why do I want to go back to my pre-trauma self that's been through less? I would never want to go through the last year again, but my values have changed. I've learned lessons. I don't want to go through what I've been through in order to learn those lessons again. I want to learn to bounce forward. I want to take the good, the bad, the difficult, the joy, the pain, the tears, the anguish, and learn to bounce forwards. So there's a little bit of an illustration I use in the book. It's a bit of a difference between a tennis ball, which bounces back, and if I got that, and it will bend back into shape, and it was all going to be cool. But if I bury the tennis ball, basically, within a very short time, it would decompose. Now, if I did the same with tomato, and drop that, it would be a mess. If I squeezed it, it would be a mess. There's no bouncing back with a tomato. But bury the tomato in the ground with the right condition, it starts to grow. It bounces forwards. And I actually believe, here's the good news, that out of trauma often comes growth. There's a quote that I use from a guy called Chris Johnson. He says this: when adversity is followed by new growth, when we rise again, but in a different form, this can be seen as bouncing forwards. So as well as post-traumatic stress, you can have post-traumatic growth. And I think that's really fascinating. It's because resilience isn't a fixed trait. So in the book, we talk a little bit about the resilience river. Now, you're going to have a go at doing this at home, hopefully. As you leave, you're going to get one of these little postcards. And as you can see, there's the word resilience there, and there's arrows that point down and arrows that point up. Now, at the bottom, you can see these rocks here. Now, these rocks represent stuff in our lives. So, for instance, one rock for me would be health anxiety. I really struggle with anxiety. It's not something I've been healed from. It's something I manage. It's something I haven't been cured from. But I feel like I get healed a little bit each day, if that makes sense. But I know that when my resilience levels are low, bang, I'm going to crash into that rock. For some of you, it might be school. Some people love school. Some people hate school. Education, it may be work. And, I can cope with this. But actually, when my resilience levels are low, it's going to be really, really difficult for me to keep going. I'm going to crash. I've got 2 teenagers, and I've worked out my teenagers that it's really easy to upset them. I want to be really honest with you. I upset my daughter, Kezia. She's 18. I feel a bit ashamed to tell you what I did. We were at the dinner table, and I really upset her. I was breathing too loudly. And I said sorry. I wasn't being sensitive enough. And of course, then I did the unforgivable sin. I asked her to empty the dishwasher. And to be fair to her, I'd forgotten. She had done it 4 years ago, and I had forgotten that. And I should have just let it go. But the thing is this, they're silly little illustrations, but when your resilience levels are low, then actually it becomes really tough. So a really good question is this, is what are the things that will keep my levels up? And what are the things that push me down? Now, I guarantee, when you have a go at doing this, is most of you are going to be able to work out what pushes you down really, really quickly. But actually what raises you up is really, really hard. And so I want to look at a little bit of a really famous story in the Bible, Jeremiah 29, verse 11, which is probably the most famous, one of the most famous verses in the Old Testament. And you all know what it is. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and to give you hope. Now, the challenge with this verse is actually it's been made into T-shirts, it's been made into posters, but it is the most taken out of context verse in the whole of the Bible. And you see, the people of God, they've been taken into exile. So basically, what's happened is they've literally hundreds of Jews have been marched across several hundred miles of desert. Hebrews marched across 700 miles of desert to a place called Babylon, and they have to stay there in exile. There's no Levitical sacrifices. There's no place where Yahweh is worshipped. There's no temple of God. To put, in a way they put it, is they just felt like aliens in a foreign land. They felt abandoned, rootless, vulnerable. What the heck is going on? They must have been saying to God. Has anyone else ever felt like that a little bit some of the times? God, I just don't get it. I love you, but I don't get it. And that's the place they're in. And see, what happens is, in Jeremiah 28, a prophet, Hananiah, comes along and says, guess what, guys? All this pain, all this anguish, all the lockdowns, everything that you're in is going to be over in 2 years. That's what it reads. You can read it in there. We're going to have time to go through it. But that's what she says. And then Jeremiah says, do you know what? It's not going to be 2 years. It's going to be 70 years. Now, the Hananiah one was a much nicer prophecy to come from. But he wrote it. He said, it's going to be 70 years until we get back to Jerusalem, and all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar will be, that nicked, is going to be restored. And he was like, you know what? In that context, this is not to be a wasted time. This is not to be a time we just write off and go, oh, well, that was a difficult period in our history. He says this is what I want you, the Lord Almighty says, the God of Israel, to those who have carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons and daughters in marriage, so they may too have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it. For it prospers, you too will prosper. In other words, you've got to accept this may be quite a difficult challenge for you guys. But here's the key thing that I really want you guys to understand. Acceptance and resignation are two really, really different things. Acceptance is actually a sign of maturity. It's interesting, we do a lot around emotional and mental health. And you know that suicide is one of the biggest killers of young men. And the interest in that is it actually kills more young men than cancer. And partly is it because we don't, as guys, we don't accept it and we don't talk about it. And so we'd just rather bottle it. And actually, we've got to come to a culture that just isn't healthy. But we have to realize just because we accept something doesn't mean we're defeated by it. It means life can go on. We're looking for the quick fix. Recently, I got to interview Anne Frank's stepsister, Eva Schloss. She's 91. She survived Auschwitz. And it was really interesting. And you know the people that didn't survive Auschwitz were the optimists. The optimists died quick. I'll be out by Christmas. I'll be out by Easter. They died really quick. The people that survived Auschwitz were the ones that accepted the situation, adapted to it, but never lost hope. And if that's a lesson for us to learn today, I don't know what it is. And that's what he was saying to the people of God. You see, we can look like we're all okay on the outside. I think this image coming up here is so incredibly powerful. But actually on the outside, we're something else. We've got to be more honest. We've got to be more real. We've got to start having these conversations. And so maybe we need to accept some 4 things. So here's a little few ideas maybe you could accept. That it's okay not to be okay. Maybe you could accept it's okay to have limitations. You don't have to be a superhero. It's life is never going to be perfect. You don't have to be all things to all people. You can have questions. You don't have to agree with everyone. That's pretty good, right? You don't have to agree with everyone. Lost my page now. Oh, it's on the floor. Thank you. Thank you for calling me darling as well. That was quite nice. You don't have to agree with everyone. Anxiety isn't weakness. Struggling doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. You're loved no matter what. They're the things that are worth accepting. Second thing, which I think can really lower our resilience, is particularly at the moment, is how we deal with loss. And, again, in this story, the Book of Lamentations, I don't know how many of you have actually read the Book of Lamentations. It's a pretty hard read. But the Book of Lamentations is there because it talks about loss. It talks about how we should handle loss. It is about a people who feel so vulnerable. There was a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She said there are these 5 stages of grief. You've probably heard of them. And she talked about the 5 stages of grief being denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And when I was writing the book Bouncing Forwards, I didn't like these stages of grief because I think what I do is I get stuck in them. I get stuck in one and then I don't make it. I want to get to acceptance, but I don't quite get there. And I often stay in anger, and then I feel guilty for being in anger because no one in church talks about anger. But anger is an emotional response to pain. You know that. And there's nowhere in the Bible it says don't get angry. It says do not let anger become a resident, but it's actually probably a healthy visitor, which is interesting, right? And so I never quite make it on this. And I was really like, I just don't get it. And then my friend, Tanya Marlowe, who is a precious friend, she's got ME. She gets out of bed for an hour a day. She's got an incredible mind, though. And she said, when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross were writing these stages of grief, she wasn't writing it for those that were left behind. She was writing it for those that were dying. So actually, what we've done is we've taken something and we're using it in the wrong way. And she says grief is far messier. She says this, grief is messier. It comes in bursts. It has its own timetable. It doesn't fit with what we want it to do. We want to plow a line straight through grief, but it's more like surfing. You just got to keep afloat. And who knows that during this time of COVID that some of you guys would have gone through so many different types of losses. And have you noticed that with this whole situation we're going through now, even with the uncertainty, you have good days and you have bad days, or is it just me? Is anyone else just have good days and bad days? And then you try and work out, well, I'm having a good day 1 minute and I'm rubbish the next minute. Like, what's going on? And I found this analogy really, really helpful. That if you imagine grief as a box, and in that box is a ball, and we call it grief, and there's a pain button. And what happens when something major happens, something really traumatic happens, is that the ball hits the pain button all the time. And, COVID's been so traumatic for some people. Major bereavement's traumatic. A loss of job's traumatic. And it feels overwhelming, doesn't it? But what happens over time is grief doesn't disappear. There's no neat pattern to grief, but the ball gets smaller. But it's still bouncing around the box quite a lot. And so it still hits the pain button, but it hits it less often. So a really good analogy for this is my wife the other day. She was really sad because her grandma died. Her grandma died 20 years ago. And me being the most pastoral, loving, caring husband went, I thought you would have got over that by now. And she was like, today, I miss my grandma. I'm sad she doesn't see my kids growing up the way that I do. Because the ball, bang, hit the pain button. And it hurt. It hurt almost just as much the days afterwards. And I think that's the way grief works. The other thing I'd want to say is that grief works in a way where we need to stop playing top trumps with pain. So I talk about grief with a capital G and a lowercase g. Capital G is major bereavement, major loss. It affects everything. Lowercase g is loss of friends, loss of camaraderie, loss of education, loss of a job, loss of, we had to cancel our holiday. My daughter couldn't have her 18th birthday party, which was a bit of a relief for me because it means I had more money now. But you know what I mean? It's like there are losses everywhere. Now, whether you've got a capital G or a lowercase g, the point is this. You need to learn to grieve them the same way by labeling your emotions. The other thing that I've discovered in looking at this is a lot of people struggle with what I call ambiguous losses, which is there's no clear definition like a point of death. So for instance, an ambiguous loss would be often single people longing for a relationship but never had it, longing for kids but don't know if they can have kids because they've never been in that relationship. My nan had Alzheimer's. That was an ambiguous loss because for 10 years I went to visit her. When I started visiting her, she was fine. By the time, just before she passed away, she had no clue who I was. And it was like, at what point do I start grieving for that process? And we all go through those ambiguous, the loss of a dream, when you need to learn to let something go. And there's other times you need to fight for it. Do you understand? And that's the way that grief works. And when he was talking to people in exile, he was saying to them, this is how it is. So the book of Lamentations, there's this beautiful verse right smack bang in the middle. It says this, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassion never fails. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I'll say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I'll wait for him. I want to show you this tiny little video now. It's only 60 seconds. It sort of describes my prayer life. Check this out. Scrabble with God, spelling out, dear God, and they're trying to get this really nice, articulate letter to God about how they feel, and by spelling it out with different letters. And in the end, they try that a few times, and in the end, they're like, I just can't do it. So they just drop the letters in a pile, and God says, yeah, I know. I get it. I get it. I get it. Now, the about the resilience river, and the third thing about this whole issue, what's going on here on Jeremiah 29, is the reason this verse is the most taken out of verse in the Bible is we often apply it to individuals. Have you noticed that? It's the verse that we pray over people before they go to university. We send people out with this verse. And the verse that I have plans to prosper you and to give you future and to give you hope wasn't written to an individual. It was written to a community. So when it says you, it's plural. It means you all. It wasn't just about you. It wasn't just about your career. It was the sense that these were people in a community. And I think for us that we really need to discover what community is again, what relationship is, what safe, authentic relationships are. So a couple of years ago now, me and my wife Diane, we started this charity called Kintsugi Hope, which I know some of you have been on the course, some of you have been involved in. Kintsugi is a Japanese word. It means golden joinery. So if you get a pot and you break it, we tend to mend it with super glue. We hide the cracks. We pretend it's not broken. What they do in Japan is they put a gold powder in the glue. So instead of hiding the cracks, they make a feature of the cracks. Arguably, the object becomes more beautiful for being broken. It certainly becomes more unique. There isn't a bowl like that on planet Earth. And I'm a firm believer that beauty comes from brokenness. And so we wanted to do two things. We wanted to start a charity that was going to tackle social isolation, because loneliness is a killer actually, and give positive mental health. And so what we started to do is we wanted to do, let's start a movement, not just a charity, a place where people can really come where they feel like they can belong. So to cut a really long story short, we wrote this 12-week program, a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for well-being. And before COVID, we thought this would be brilliant. What we'll do is we'll train churches all over the country to deliver this in their community. And churches got really excited about it. They were like, oh, we could do this in the pub, and we could do this in Costa Coffee, and we could do this with our life group, and we can do this in the sports. And, they started happening in homeless shelters. They started happening, they were going to run one in the farmers market because suicide rates amongst farmers is really, really high. And they thought, we can outreach to these people. And then COVID hit. And I thought, we are doomed. We have just started this charity. It is all going to go pear-shaped. So we moved all our training online, and we carried on training churches across the country. And so this was our basically where we were before COVID. These are all the churches we are working with. And this is what it looks like now. It's gotten a little bit crazy. And actually, there has been a real move of God. We are hearing stories of people coming back to faith, people getting baptized. Beautiful story of a lady who'd lost her kid to foster care. If you've lost your kid to foster care, basically a judge has said that you're not fit to be a mum anymore. And they were running the Kintsugi group on Zoom, and for the first 3 weeks, you couldn't see her face. You could just see her silhouette because she felt ashamed. She didn't want anyone to see her, and so she sat in this dark room. Week 4 is on shame, and it's all about shame. It's about owning your story, about stepping out of the darkness, stepping out of secrecy, silence, and judgment. And then week 4, and the light's back on, and you can see her face for the first time. And I think that's mad, because I think that's what Jesus does. He allows us to step out of shame. We heard other stories of people doing it with people of no faith. And then the people of no faith turned around to the people of faith and went, "You Christians, we just thought you were a bunch of do-gooders. But for the last 6 weeks, you've just shared your frailties and your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities. You've changed our view on Christianity." And I think something beautiful is starting to happen. And you know, for me, it's not about trying to fix people, it's about trying to love them. And I'm praying that we would see a massive move of God's Spirit. And I said to God a while ago, you know, if the next big move of your Spirit is going to come in some massive warehouse somewhere, in some mega building, and we're going to film it and broadcast it all around the world on God TV or whatever it is, and we're going to call it revival, I think I might just quit. But you know what? If something special could happen in youth groups and schools and universities and prisons and brothels and pubs and coffee shops and parks, mums and toddlers, where people feel broken and lonely and isolated. If something could happen in those groups, and it's not led by the great and the fantastic, but maybe by the fragile and the humble and the vulnerable, and it can happen in the grassroots of community, I am properly up for that. C.S. Lewis says this: friendship is born at the moment when one person says to another, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one." And so my prayer is that you would know this passage is to help you to raise your levels of resilience. Accept that actually and resignation are different things. Learn to grieve well. And thirdly, realize that we're in it together. We're a community. We're a community of people that love and want to serve Jesus. I finished with this story. A while ago now, I went to New York. I went to a place called the 9/11 Memorial Museum. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. As you go out of the 9/11 Memorial Museum, you come across what's called the Cross of Ground Zero. In the explosion, there was this 17-foot crossbeam that was welded together. And this image I find incredibly moving. In this hellish wasteland where they're literally pulling out bodies, and it must have been smelly, it must have been horrendous, it must have been so traumatic. Suddenly this cross appears. And so they take it out. The local priest said, "Can you put it on a pedestal?" And from that day onwards, people came, different cultures, different ages, different abilities. They came with their anguish, they came with their confusion, they came with their unanswered prayers, they came with their laments. And they stood before the cross, they cried, they laughed, they worshipped. And Father Brian said, this was not a place of defeat, this is a place of hope. You know, it's really interesting. In the Old Testament, the cross, holiness was known as a place of being separate, wasn't it? And the holiest place in the New Testament, where's that? It wasn't the Holy of Holies, it was the cross. And so the cross was on a rubbish dump outside Jerusalem. And so holiness in the New Testament isn't about being separate, being in our little huddle somewhere. It's about being involved in the mess of people's lives. That's what holiness is. It's about involvement and engagement. And it's a symbol of hope. I'm going to finish, and I'm going to pray for you guys just by reading a poem from Bouncing Forwards from a lovely friend of mine called Jane. Jane has a very rare form of blood cancer. And when she found out that I was starting a charity called Kintsugi Hope, she said, "I've written you a poem." And she's just the sweetest. And I thought it'd be nice to finish by reading it to you. It says this: acceptance in the anguish, belief in the brokenness, comfort in the conflict, courage in the crisis, determination in the dust, direction in the difficulty, faith in the fear, grace in the grief, healing in the horror, inspiration in the illness, love in the loneliness, opportunity in the ordeal, peace in the panic, purpose in the pain, refuge in the regrets, rest in the restrictions, sanctuary in the suffering, stillness in the storm, support in the sadness, treasure in the trials, trust in the trauma, victory in the vulnerability, and wisdom in the weakness. Guys, you are so special, and I really hope that out of one tiny little thing I've said today, that you will learn to accept the situation you're in, to grieve well, but also to realize you are never, ever on your own, that you are bespoke, that you are unique, that beauty can come from brokenness. I love the Kintsugi image, actually. I just think it's so beautiful. And I've got a friend called Catherine, actually, and she makes Kintsugi art pendants. There's some on the stand that all bespoke. She sits there for ages just making them all different, because that describes who we are. That beauty will come out of brokenness. If you're able, why don't you stand and let me pray for you guys, and then we'll worship. Thank you. Father God, I want to thank you for every single person here today. I want to thank you for their life. I want to thank you for the things we know about and others know about them, and the things they don't know about them. But Father, I thank you that you know absolutely everything. You know every thought, every emotion that we've buried, every emotion that we've expressed. That you know us inside out. And God, I pray that you would come by your Spirit now, even amongst all the challenges of a hot day and face masks and everything else. God, won't you just come and rest on your people, Lord Jesus? Where people need to grieve, Lord, because they've lost stuff, actually. And maybe they don't even realize they've lost it sometimes. The ball's been hitting the pain button and it hurts. God, I pray, be with them. Emmanuel, God with us. Jesus, I pray, Lord God, that we would just know you in this place. Holy Spirit, we love you, Jesus. We love you, Jesus. And as we worship, maybe there's some things you feel, God, I just need to let go of this. I've been holding this for too long. It's a bit like a bottle. If I held this for a minute, it's going to be fine. If I hold it for an hour, my arm's going to be killing me, right? And sometimes we hold on to stuff. And sometimes in the context of worship, it's the best context to give everything over to God. God, I'm yours. I give you all the stuff from the last 16 months. I give it to you. I can't carry it on my own. It's just too much. It's just too much. God bless you. Thank you.